When we hear the word plague, our minds jump to the Black Death, Europe's most infamous killer. But history is littered with other diseases, just as cruel, just as terrifying, and yet they are forgotten. Their victims erased, their scars left hidden beneath layers of time. Tonight we will bring them back, not the plagues that everyone knows, but the ones history buried in silence. Some killed swiftly, burning through villages in days. Others lingered for centuries, haunting families across generations. They were not only killers, they were teachers. They shaped the way people built their cities, the way they prayed, the way they feared the night. And as you listen now, in the quiet of your room, you may realize that these plagues are not truly gone. They are shadows, waiting. Why plagues are forgotten. Why do some plagues vanish from memory, while others remain legendary? Sometimes it is because they came suddenly and disappeared just as quickly, leaving little behind but whispers. Sometimes it is because they struck the powerless, the poor, or the colonized, people whose suffering was rarely written into history books. And sometimes they are forgotten because we simply choose not to remember, for memory is heavy, and disease is a terror that humanity would rather bury than face again. Fear in the Middle Ages. Imagine the Middle Ages, where every shadow held mystery. A cough, a rash, a fever could mean not only death, but divine punishment. People spoke of curses, of demons, of air itself poisoned by invisible forces. Without science, the world seemed like a battlefield between heaven and hell, and plagues were their most terrifying soldiers. These forgotten plagues thrived in such a world. They did not need explanations. They needed only bodies, and bodies they found in plenty. Our journey tonight. So tonight we will not rush. We will take the slow walk of a fevered man down a deserted street. We will linger in the rooms where sweat soaked the bed sheets of the dying. We will hear the echoes of footsteps dancing against cobblestones, the cries of mothers watching children bleed from their eyes, the choking breath of poets fading away in candlelit rooms. We will explore plagues that science has not solved, that history has not honored, that memory has not kept alive. And in doing so, we will realize that the forgotten can be more terrifying than the remembered, because the forgotten can return. The sweating sickness is gone now. No cure was ever found. No true cause was ever discovered. It came, it killed, and it vanished. But its shadow remains. It is a reminder that the forgotten plagues are not less dangerous, only less remembered. And memory, as history shows us, is a fragile thing. From the sweat-soaked beds of England, we now move to something stranger still. Not a plague of fever, nor a plague of sores, but a plague of movement. A city cursed not with silence, but with endless, fatal motion. This is the story of the dancing plague of Strasbourg. The dancing plague of 1518. In the heat of July, in the bustling city of Strasbourg, a strange sight appeared in the marketplace. A woman stepped into the square, barefoot, her face pale, her body trembling. But instead of collapsing, she began to dance, and dance, and dance. This was not joy. It was not celebration. It was something far darker, for what followed would become one of the most bizarre plagues in human history, the plague of endless, fatal dancing. The first dancer, her name, according to the records, was Frau Trophäa. For hours she danced in the summer sun, her movements jerky, uncontrolled, her face twisted in anguish. People gathered to watch, curious at first, then horrified as she showed no sign of stopping. Day turned to night, and still she danced. Her feet blistered, blood seeped from her heels, but she could not rest. She was not alone for long. Within days, dozens joined her, compelled by some unseen force, their bodies moving without end. A city in motion, Strasbourg, a thriving city, on the banks of the Rhine, soon found its streets filled with dancers. Men, women, even children, swaying, spinning, collapsing from exhaustion, only to rise again. Eyewitnesses described them as possessed, their faces twisted in pain and terror. They begged for relief, but their limbs betrayed them. The sound of groaning bodies and shuffling feet echoed through the narrow streets, mingling with the smell of sweat and blood. As days turned into weeks, the numbers grew. From a single woman, the plague spread to more than 400 souls. The city became a stage for a grim performance no one had asked to witness. The authorities' response. The city council, desperate to contain the madness, believed the only cure was to let the dancers exhaust themselves. And so they hired musicians. Drums and flutes filled the air, turning the streets into makeshift dance floors. But the music did not soothe. It only fueled the frenzy. Dancers twitched and spun until their legs broke beneath them. Some collapsed from strokes and heart attacks. Others simply fell and did not rise again. The cure had become the executioner. Death in rhythm, imagine it. A summer night in 1518. The moon casts silver light over the cathedral spire. In the square below, hundreds of figures writhe and stumble, their bodies glistening with sweat, their breath ragged. A drum beats steadily, and with every strike, another life flickers out. The cobblestones are slick with blood from torn feet. The smell of sickness and desperation fills the air. Yet the dancers do not stop. They cannot stop. What was it? The dancing plague has baffled historians for centuries. Some believed it was mass hysteria, a psychological contagion born of famine, disease, and fear. Strasbourg had suffered from poor harvests, hunger, and outbreaks of smallpox. Perhaps the stress of survival broke the minds of its people, and the dance became their desperate escape. Others point to ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus that grows on rye bread. Consuming it can cause convulsions, tremors, and hallucinations. Yet critics argue that ergot poisoning usually incapacitates its victims, not drive them to dance for weeks. Still others whisper of possession, demons sent to torment the faithful, or saints punishing sin with restless limbs. To the people of 1518, science offered no answer. All they saw was their neighbors dancing themselves to death. Echoes in history. The Strasbourg outbreak was not the first. Records describe smaller outbreaks of dancing mania across Europe in earlier centuries, from Aachen in 1374 to Cologne and Metz in the 15th century. Groups of people, sometimes hundreds at a time, gripped by uncontrollable movement, often marching in processions until they collapsed. The plague of Strasbourg was simply the most infamous and the most deadly. The psychology of frenzy. Perhaps the truest horror of the dancing plague lies not in disease, but in the mind. Human beings are not only vulnerable to viruses and bacteria, but to suggestion, fear, and collective madness. In a time when explanations were few and superstitions many, one woman's affliction became a city's curse. The human brain, pushed to its limits by hunger, faith, and fear, may have betrayed its own body, forcing people to dance when all they wanted was to rest. The silence. After the dance, after nearly 2 months, the dancing finally ceased. Survivors staggered back to their homes, broken in body and spirit. The dead were buried quietly, their names forgotten, their graves unmarked. Life in Strasbourg resumed, but whispers of the madness lingered for generations. Parents warned children not to mock the afflicted, lest the curse return. Priests reminded congregations that even joy, the dance, could become a tool of death when twisted by forces unseen. The dancing plague of 1518 remains unsolved. Was it poison, possession, madness, or something we have yet to name? History offers no certain answer. What it does offer is a chilling reminder. The body can betray, the mind can break, and entire cities can be caught in the rhythm of despair. But this was not the last forgotten plague. For now we turn from motion to silence, to a sickness that robbed its victims of their very breath, leaving only pale corpses and shattered families. This is the story of consumption, the white plague that haunted centuries. The White Plague. For centuries, it haunted the world like a ghost. It was not sudden like the sweating sickness, nor bizarre like the dancing plague. No, this was a slow killer, a patient thief. It stole breath by breath, day by day, leaving its victims pale, thin, and broken. It was called consumption, but history remembers it better as the White Plague. The shape of the disease. Imagine it. A young woman, once healthy and lively, now sitting by a window, wrapped in blankets. Despite the summer heat, her skin is pale, almost translucent. Her cheeks burn with a feverish flush. Each breath is shallow, ragged, punctuated by fits of coughing. She presses a cloth to her lips. When she pulls it away, it is stained with blood. This was the image of tuberculosis. It was called the romantic disease by poets and artists. A cruel irony. Its wasting effects gave its victims a certain frail beauty. Thin bodies, bright eyes, flushed cheeks. Pain was mistaken for passion, sickness for elegance. But behind the poetry lay a horror that consumed millions. A death without mercy. Tuberculosis did not strike in a single night. It stretched its claws slowly, pulling its victims down over months, even years. The cough grew worse. The nights filled with sweats and shivering fevers. Appetite vanished, bodies withered. Some coughed until their ribs cracked, until blood filled their lungs. And yet, through it all, the mind often remained clear, forcing victims to endure their decline with full awareness. Families watched helplessly as loved ones wasted away, one by one. The sound of coughing became the soundtrack of entire households, and when one died, it was not long before another began to cough. The plague of cities. Tuberculosis thrived where humanity gathered most closely. The growing cities of Europe became its breeding ground. Factories, tenements, and slums filled with poor ventilation, damp walls, and crowds of workers offered the perfect conditions. In London, in Paris, in New York, the White Plague walked openly, cutting down the poor in staggering numbers. In some neighborhoods, 1 in every 4 deaths was caused by consumption. It was not confined to the poor alone. The disease did not respect wealth or titles. Kings and queens, philosophers and poets, artists and composers, tuberculosis claimed them all. John Keats, Anton Chekhov, Chopin, each wasted away under its grip, their works forever haunted by their illness. Theories and misunderstandings. For centuries, no one knew what caused it. Some said it was hereditary, passed down like a curse in the blood. Others blamed bad air, poor morals, or divine punishment. Quacks offered remedies of all kinds: tonics, elixirs, breathing exercises, long stays in the mountains or by the sea. Doctors prescribed bloodletting, believing it would drain the sickness. None of it worked. Patients were sent to sanatoriums, lonely buildings high in the mountains where cold air and isolation were thought to cure the disease. There, pale figures lay on verandas in blankets, staring silently at the horizon, waiting for death, or, in rare cases, a miracle. The discovery, it was not until 1882 that Dr. Robert Koch identified the true culprit, a tiny bacterium, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. At last, the enemy had a name, but knowing the name did not bring victory. Treatments were slow to develop, and millions continued to die well into the 20th century. In the meantime, tuberculosis carved itself into culture. It was in novels, in operas, in paintings. The coughing heroine, doomed by her frailty, became a tragic archetype. Art turned suffering into beauty. But in the streets, there was nothing beautiful about the way it hollowed out families and emptied graveyards. The toll of centuries historians estimate that over the course of centuries, tuberculosis has killed more people than any other single infectious disease in human history. Entire generations lived under its shadow. The toll was so constant, so unending, that it became part of daily life. Families expected to lose children, siblings, parents. The cough was everywhere, in workshops, in schools, in churches. Death became familiar, almost routine. Personal horror: picture this. You are a child in 19th century London. You share a single small room with your parents and 3 siblings. The air is damp, heavy with smoke from the factory fires. Your sister begins to cough, at first lightly, then more violently. She spits blood into a rag, but still she works at the mill. Soon she is too weak to rise from bed. You sit beside her, listening as she gasps for air, her chest rattling. One night she dies quietly, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and before the year ends, another sibling begins to cough. A disease that still lingers, unlike the sweating. Sickness, tuberculosis, never vanished. Treatments eventually came. The discovery of antibiotics in the 20th century offered hope. Sanatoriums emptied, families rejoiced. But the White Plague is not gone. Even now, it lingers in the shadows of poverty, in the crowded cities of the world, claiming over 1 million lives each year. A ghost that refuses to leave. Soundscape. Faint echo of coughing fades into silence, then a church organ plays a low note. The White Plague was more than an illness. It was a presence, a constant companion of humanity, shaping art, culture, and fear itself. It was proof that not all plagues burn out in firestorms of death. Some simply settle in, quietly, patiently, waiting. But not all forgotten plagues were invisible. Some left their mark in flesh, twisting the human form into shapes both pitiful and terrifying. From the pale frailty of consumption, we now move to the disfiguring curse of leprosy. The plague of leprosy. There are plagues that kill quickly and plagues that kill slowly. But some do not only kill the body, they destroy identity, dignity, and belonging. For more than 1,000 years, one disease haunted humanity, not only as an illness, but as a curse. It marked its victims in the flesh, twisting them into outcasts. It was called leprosy. and to suffer from it was to be exiled while still alive. The first signs it often began quietly. A patch of numb skin, a tingling in the fingers, a small sore that refused to heal. Slowly, the disease spread, disfiguring the face, weakening the limbs, eroding fingers and toes. In an age without microscopes, it seemed to rot the body from within, transforming once familiar faces into something strange, unrecognizable. But the greatest cruelty of leprosy was not always death. It was the living death of being cast out from one's own family and community. The life of an outcast from the Middle Ages through the early modern period, lepers were banished to the margins of society. Many were forced into leper houses, isolated hospitals, often under the control of the church. Once admitted, a patient might never see their family again. Priests performed funeral rites for the afflicted as if they were already dead. Some were made to wear special clothing or carry bells to announce their approach. The sound of that bell meant only one thing: contagion, impurity, and fear. Imagine it. Walking through a medieval marketplace, the chatter of merchants filling the air. Then a bell tolls, heads turn. A figure approaches, wrapped in rags, face scarred and twisted. Mothers pull children away. Merchants hide their wares. The leper passes in silence, the bell echoing in their wake. Still alive, but treated as though the grave had already claimed them. Fear and misunderstanding. To medieval society, leprosy was not only a sickness of the body, it was a sickness of the soul. Many believed it was punishment from God for sin or evidence of moral corruption. Victims were accused of uncleanliness, of lust, of heresy. Some believed lepers carried demonic taint, spreading evil wherever they walked. Others claimed they poisoned wells or conspired with enemies. To be afflicted was to be branded guilty even if you had done nothing wrong. The horror of the leper. Houses across Europe, thousands of leper houses were built. From the outside, they resembled monasteries. Inside, they were prisons of suffering. Rows of patients with bandaged hands, ulcerated faces, and missing limbs lay in silence, their groans echoing against stone walls. Some tried to find comfort in prayer. Others sat in despair, staring at the horizon, knowing they would never leave. The smell of rot and infection filled the air, mingled with incense from chapel altars. These were places where hope rarely entered. The true cause today, we know leprosy as Hansen's disease, caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae. It spreads not easily, but slowly through prolonged contact. It does not rot flesh away, but it damages nerves, leading to injuries that cannot be felt, infections that destroy tissue, and deformities that mark the body forever. But medieval people could not see the bacterium. They saw only the outward signs, and to them, it was proof of corruption. The science of disease was centuries away. In the meantime, fear ruled. Leprosy and faith. For some, leprosy was paradoxically seen as a gift, a chance to share in Christ's suffering. Some, lepers, were even revered as holy, their suffering seen as sacred. But these were rare exceptions. For most, leprosy was a life sentence of loneliness. The disease blurred the line between the sacred and the damned, leaving victims trapped between reverence and revulsion. The long decline, unlike the sweating sickness, leprosy never swept through cities in sudden waves. Instead, it lingered. Slowly, century after century, it haunted Europe, Asia, Africa, and beyond. But as the centuries passed, cases began to decline. By the 17th century, leper houses in Europe emptied, their bells falling silent. The reason remains debated. Perhaps improved hygiene, perhaps competition from more aggressive diseases like plague and tuberculosis. But the stigma outlasted the sickness. Even today, in some parts of the world, those with Hansen's disease are shunned, exiled, and feared. The legacy of fear leprosy's greatest legacy is not medical, but social. It showed how disease can fracture communities, turning neighbors into strangers, families into enemies. It proved that sometimes the deadliest wounds are not physical, but emotional. The pain of being cut off, of being treated as less than human. The plague of leprosy was not only the spread of a bacterium, it was the spread of fear, shame, and silence. Leprosy is no longer the terror it once was. Modern medicine can cure it. But for centuries, it shaped societies, laws, and even faith itself. It is a reminder that plagues do not always kill in numbers. Sometimes they kill through isolation, turning the living into the forgotten. But while leprosy consumed its victims slowly, another forgotten plague struck with fire and speed, burning through the blood. To understand it, we must travel to the swamps, the ships, and the fever-stricken ports where Yellow Jack, the yellow fever, reigned. Yellow fever, the sickness of swamps and ships. There are diseases that creep slowly, and there are diseases that strike like lightning. Yellow fever was the latter. It burned through bodies with terrifying speed, leaving behind corpses and empty streets. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it stalked ports, plantations, and entire cities. An invisible killer carried on the wings of a mosquito. The arrival of Yellow Jack. For centuries, sailors whispered of a sickness that clung to the tropics. They called it Yellow Jack after the yellow quarantine flag flown on infected ships. A crew might leave port healthy, only to arrive with men vomiting blood, skin turning jaundiced, and death spreading faster than cargo. The disease terrified port cities across the Americas, Africa, and Europe. It thrived in swampy waters and humid air, the breeding ground of the Aedes aegypti mosquito. But no one knew this at the time. Instead, they blamed foul air, bad morals, or even curses from the enslaved peoples forced to labor in the colonies. Meanwhile, the mosquitoes fed silently, carrying death in every bite. The stages of death. The illness began with fever, chills, and headaches, symptoms so ordinary they gave little warning. But soon the skin turned yellow, stained by the failure of the liver. Then came the horror, black vomit, caused by internal bleeding. Some bled from the nose, mouth, and eyes. Death could come in days, sometimes hours. In outbreaks, bodies piled in streets. Cemeteries filled faster than graves could be dug. The stench of decay mixed with the humid air, creating cities of both the living and the dying. Port cities in panic yellow fever was the terror of trade. In colonial Havana, New Orleans, and Philadelphia, outbreaks crippled economies. Ships were quarantined, sailors abandoned, ports sealed. In Philadelphia's epidemic of 1793, nearly 10% of the city's population perished in a single season. Families fled, leaving homes behind. Those who stayed locked themselves indoors, hoping the fever would pass them by. But no wall could keep out mosquitoes. The scapegoats, as with many plagues, fear turned neighbors against one another. Immigrants were blamed for bringing the disease. The poor were accused of filth and immorality. In some cases, enslaved Africans were thought immune, leading to dangerous myths that fueled exploitation. Communities fractured under suspicion, while the real culprit, the mosquito, went unnoticed. The hospitals of suffering, in makeshift hospitals, patients writhed in fever. Doctors applied leeches, purges, and bloodletting, desperate but useless. Priests whispered last rites as patients vomited black blood. Nurses struggled to keep up as the dying far outnumbered the living. Some victims begged for water but could not swallow. Others screamed until hemorrhage silenced them. The truth revealed. It wasn't until the late 19th century that the mystery was solved. Dr. Carlos Finley of Cuba first proposed that mosquitoes spread the disease, but he was ignored. Years later, U.S. Army physician Walter Reed confirmed it, forever changing medicine. The invisible killer had a face, the tiny mosquito. With sanitation campaigns and mosquito control, outbreaks declined, but the scars of centuries remained. Yellow fever's shadow for the enslaved and the colonized, yellow fever was not only a disease, it was a weapon. In tropical regions, Europeans often died in droves, while local populations, exposed for generations, developed partial immunity. Colonial armies crumbled in the fever's grip. In some ways, yellow fever shaped history itself, deciding wars and revolutions. The Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history, was aided by yellow fever, which decimated Napoleon's troops more effectively than any battlefield could. The legacy of terror, even now, yellow fever, has not vanished. It lingers in parts of Africa and South America, striking where vaccination is scarce. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was more than a disease. It was a terror that haunted ships, swamps, and cities. It showed how something as small as a mosquito could change the fate of nations. And it reminded humanity that nature does not need armies to conquer. Sometimes, all it takes is wings and blood. Yellow fever was fire in the blood, fast and merciless. But the next forgotten plague was colder, a disease of silence, wasting away minds and bodies in shadows. To find it, we must step into the asylums and prisons where syphilis, the great pox, left its mark. The great pox, syphilis, and the madness of flesh. In the late 15th century, a new disease appeared in Europe. It spread with shocking speed, disfigured with merciless cruelty, and tormented the body and mind alike. To its victims, it seemed like a punishment worse than plague. They called it the Great Pox. We call it syphilis. The first outbreaks. The story begins in 1494 during the French invasion of Naples. Soldiers celebrated victory with wine, feasts, and women. But soon, a strange sickness appeared. Men developed sores, fevers, and rashes. Flesh decayed, noses collapsed, and pain twisted their joints. Many went mad before death. The disease spread across Europe in months, carried by armies, merchants, and sailors. No plague had ever traveled so fast. To contemporaries, it seemed like divine wrath unleashed for human sin. The symptoms of horror. The Great Pox did not kill quickly. Instead, it dragged its victims through years of agony. First, open sores and ulcers, then a rash across the skin. Later, bones aching with pain, the body wasting away. In its final stages, syphilis invaded the brain, causing hallucinations, seizures, and madness. Victims raved in delirium, some violent, some catatonic. Others composed strange, rambling writings that made no sense, fragments of genius lost to disease. A disease of shame unlike plague or smallpox, syphilis carried. A unique burden, shame. It was linked to sex, desire, and the flesh. Priests thundered from pulpits that the pox was God's punishment for lust. Victims hid their sores beneath layers of clothing, fearing disgrace as much as death. But shame could not stop the spread. Kings, poets, courtesans, and beggars alike suffered. The great pox knew no boundaries. Desperate cures medicine offered little relief. One common treatment was mercury. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, the saying went. Patients were rubbed with mercury ointments, inhaled mercury vapors, even swallowed it. The results were horrific. Lost teeth, poisoned organs, drooling mouths. Some survived, though often crippled by both the disease and the cure. Others died more quickly from mercury than from syphilis itself. Famous victims' rumors swirled around famous sufferers. Some claimed that King Henry, fate bore the disease, his violent mood swings and decaying health a sign of syphilis. Artists, poets, and philosophers were whispered to have carried it as well. Whether true or not, the association tied the great pox to genius and madness alike. To suffer from it was to stand at the edge of death and delirium. In the asylums by the 18th and 19th centuries, the final stage of syphilis filled asylums and prisons. Patients wandered the halls, raving at invisible voices, their bodies scarred by years of decay. Doctors puzzled over the connection between sex, disease, and madness, but no cure was found. Families abandoned relatives to institutions, ashamed to speak their names. The great pox reduced once great men and women to husks, forgotten behind stone walls. The truth unveiled, only in the early 20th century did science finally identify the culprit, the bacterium Treponema pallidum. And with the discovery of penicillin in the 1940s, a true cure arrived at last. The centuries-long reign of the great pox came to an end, but the shadows it left, of shame, secrecy, and stigma, still linger in our culture's memory of disease. The legacy of syphilis. The great pox is more than a medical story. It is a reminder of how fear and morality can shape the way we treat the sick. For centuries, sufferers were not only dying, they were judged. And judgment, history shows, can be as cruel as any plague. Soundscape. Whispering voices fade into silence, then a single church bell tolls slowly. The great pox showed how illness could corrode not just flesh, but dignity. But our journey is not yet over. Another forgotten plague still waits in the shadows, one that traveled by rat, flea, and famine, striking silently in the night. It is time to confront typhus, the fever of prisons and war. Typhus, the fever of prisons and war. Some plagues spread through the air, others through water, but typhus spread through filth, through lice crawling on rags, through the bodies of the poor, the imprisoned, the forgotten. For centuries it haunted prisons, war camps, and famine-stricken towns. It was a plague of the desperate, a sickness that thrived where humanity was at its lowest. The perfect breeding ground typhus was not a sickness of kings, though kings feared it. It was the disease of soldiers and prisoners, refugees and beggars. Wherever people were crowded together, starving, unwashed, and swarming with lice, typhus struck, flea-bitten blankets, damp straw beds, filthy uniforms. These were its weapons. It spread invisibly, but once it began, it swept through camps and jails like fire. The symptoms of prison fever. The disease announced itself with sudden chills and high fever. Victims shook violently, drenched in sweat. Soon came rashes across the body, dark, angry blotches that gave the sickness its name. Spotted fever. Delirium followed. Patients raved, hallucinated, screamed in terror at visions no one else could see. Many slipped into a coma before death. Others thrashed so violently that guards feared to approach them. In some outbreaks, death rates soared above 50%. Typhus in war history is full of battles decided not by swords or cannons, but by typhus. During the 30 Years' War, more soldiers died of typhus than in combat. In Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia, his armies were decimated not only by snow and starvation, but by lice-borne fever. Camps became graveyards, wagons overflowing with corpses before the armies even met in battle. Typhus turned victory into ashes. In the prisons in jails and debtors' prisons, typhus was so common it was simply called jail fever. Judges feared it more than criminals. In 1750, an outbreak of typhus swept through London's Old Bailey courthouse during a trial. Judges, lawyers, and jurors alike fell sick. Many died within days. The disease, once confined to prisoners, leapt into the very halls of power. The message was clear. No one was safe where lice could crawl. The stench of death eyewitnesses described the horror of typhus wards. Rooms packed with bodies, the air heavy with sweat, vomit, and decay. Patients lay on straw blackened with lice, their clothes alive with crawling insects. Some clawed at their own skin in madness. Nurses, when they dared to enter, often did not survive the week. It was said that the stench alone could kill, though in truth, it was the lice that did the work. The discovery for centuries, no one understood how typhus spread. Many blamed foul air or even curses. It was not until the 20th century that the culprit was identified, the body louse. Tiny, common, and easily overlooked, lice carried the bacterium Rickettsia prowazekii, injecting it into wounds when people scratched their bites. The humblest of parasites had slain millions. The shadow of typhus. Unlike plague or cholera, typhus rarely inspired great monuments or literature. It was a disease of the forgotten, of the poor, the dirty, the imprisoned. Its victims rarely wrote their stories. But its shadow runs through history, in wars lost, in prisons emptied by death, in refugees who vanished nameless into shallow graves. Typhus was a plague of shame and neglect, thriving wherever humanity was broken. It revealed how easily the smallest parasite can humble empires. But while lice spread fever, another plague waited in the soil itself, a sickness born of famine, hunger, and rot. To uncover it, we must step into the starving villages of Ireland, where the potato blight carried both plague and death. The potato blight and famine diseases. Sometimes a plague does not come from rats, lice, or the air. Sometimes it comes from hunger itself. In the mid-19th century, Ireland became the stage for one of the most devastating tragedies in European history. It was not just the potato blight that killed, but the famine, the fevers, and the diseases that followed in its wake. The blight appears in 1845. Farmers across Ireland dug into their fields, expecting a harvest of firm, nourishing potatoes. Instead, they found rot. Tubers crumbled into foul-smelling black mush, inedible, useless. A strange mold, Phytophthora infestans, had spread like wildfire, leaving only ruin behind. The potato, the lifeline of the poor, had betrayed them. Hunger becomes starvation. The Irish poor relied almost entirely on potatoes for survival. When the crops failed, year after year, famine set in. Families boiled grass and nettles for food. Mothers watched their children's bellies swell with hunger, their bodies wasting away. Whole villages grew silent, cabins abandoned as families either perished or fled across the sea in desperation. The fever camp starvation weakened the body, making it a breeding ground for disease. Typhus and relapsing fever swept through the starving population. Fever hospitals overflowed with the dying. Victims lay on bare wooden planks, covered in lice, delirious with heat. Some were buried in mass graves, their identities lost forever. Hunger had opened the door, and disease walked in without mercy. The coffin ships, for those who fled, escape was no salvation. Packed into coffin ships bound for America and Canada, emigrants endured weeks in dark, airless holds. Dysentery, cholera, and typhus spread unchecked. Bodies were thrown overboard each morning. Survivors staggered onto foreign shores, skeletal, feverish, and scarred by loss. For many, exile was just another kind of death. Politics and indifference. The famine was not only a natural disaster, it was shaped by politics, by neglect, and by cruelty. While Irish families starved, ships full of grain and livestock left Ireland for export. The government's relief efforts were meager, often too late. Hunger became not just a tragedy, but a sentence, a crime of indifference written in empty fields and silent cabins. The shadow of famine. By the time the blight loosened its grip, over 1 million Irish were dead. Another 1 million had fled. The population of Ireland would never recover. And for those who survived, famine had carved scars into memory, passed down through stories, songs, and silence. The diseases of hunger, fever, dysentery, cholera, claimed as many lives as starvation itself. The potato blight was more than rot in the soil. It was a reminder that plagues do not always wear the mask of infection. Sometimes they wear the mask of hunger, of poverty, of abandonment. But as famine loosened its grip, another shadow rose. A plague born not of crops or lice, but of our own modern world. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, would stalk humanity well into the 20th century. The Spanish flu of 1918. In the autumn of 1918, as the First World War staggered to its bloody conclusion, another enemy emerged. It did not march with boots, nor fire guns, nor carry flags. It drifted invisibly on the breath of soldiers, on the wind of trenches, and in the crowded streets of cities. It would kill more people than the war itself. It was influenza, but unlike any influenza the world had ever seen. A global shadow, the Spanish flu spread with terrifying speed. Soldiers returning home carried it to every corner of the globe. From Kansas to Calcutta, from Cape Town to Madrid, no country was spared. Within weeks, hospitals overflowed, undertakers worked day and night, and mass graves swallowed the dead. Entire communities seemed to vanish overnight. The face of the plague masks became the face of 1918. In American cities, police fined those who appeared in public without them. Trains and trams were filled with men and women hiding behind gauze, but the masks offered little protection. The virus struck swiftly. A healthy young man could wake up feeling fine, collapse by noon, and be dead by nightfall. The horror of symptoms. This influenza was no ordinary illness. Victims turned blue as their lungs filled with fluid. Some coughed up blood so violently it soaked their bedsheets. Others bled from their noses and ears. Doctors described the sick as drowning while still alive, gasping desperately for breath. Families watched in horror as loved ones suffocated within hours. The war within the war. The Spanish flu thrived in the chaos of war. Trenches, troop ships, and field hospitals became incubators of death. Soldiers, already weak from hunger and gas attacks, collapsed in rows. In some battalions, more men died from influenza than from bullets. The war ended in November 1918, but for millions, the plague had already claimed victory. The invisible. Censorship. The disease became known as the Spanish flu, not because it began in Spain, but because Spain, neutral in the war, was the first to report it freely. Other nations censored news of the outbreak, fearing panic and lowered morale. While governments stayed silent, the virus spread unchecked, its silence more deadly than its symptoms. The toll be the time it burned itself out in 1920, the Spanish flu had killed between 50 and 100 million people, more than the Black Death in the Middle Ages, more than the Great War itself. Entire generations were scarred, families erased, and the memory of mass graves haunted survivors for decades. Yet strangely, it faded from history, overshadowed by the war that raged beside it. The Spanish flu revealed how fragile the world could be, how even the most powerful nations could be brought to their knees by something smaller than a grain of dust. And as the 20th century marched on, new plagues would follow, born not in trenches or famine, but in the rapid movement of the modern age. Diseases without borders, diseases without warning, polio, and the age of vaccines. For centuries, plagues had come as waves of fever, famine, and filth. But in the 20th century, a new kind of terror emerged. It did not strike the poor in slums or soldiers in trenches. It struck children, suddenly, mercilessly, leaving them paralyzed, unable to move, sometimes unable to breathe. This was polio, the silent stalker of summer. The summer fear polio outbreaks often arrived in the heat of summer. Families closed swimming pools, kept children indoors, and avoided crowds, terrified of an invisible killer. A healthy child could go to bed laughing and wake the next morning unable to stand. Parents watched helplessly as limbs stiffened, muscles withered, and childhood itself was stolen. The iron lung for the most tragic victims, the virus attacked the muscles of the chest, leaving them unable to breathe. Hospitals filled with iron lungs, giant metal cylinders where children lay sealed, their lives dependent on a mechanical rhythm of vacuum and pressure. Rows of machines hissed in unison, a chorus of survival. Some children lived inside for weeks, others for years. The race for a cure's fear spread. Science fought back. Researchers like Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin dedicated their lives to understanding the virus. In 1955, Salk unveiled the first effective vaccine. Children lined up in schools and clinics, rolling up their sleeves, receiving injections that carried not fear but hope. Later, Sabin's oral vaccine made protection as simple as swallowing a sugar cube. The end in sight by the 1960s, polio cases began to plummet across the developed world. Campaigns spread globally, reaching villages, cities, and remote corners of the earth. Polio, once a nightmare, was on the verge of eradication. Yet even today, in some places, the disease lingers, reminding us that no plague is truly gone until the last case is silenced. Legacy of polio reshaped medicine, sparking massive public trust in vaccines and fueling the modern era of immunization. But it also left scars, survivors who lived with paralysis, families who mourned, and a generation who remembered the summers of fear. It was the first great victory of modern medicine over epidemic disease, and proof that humanity could at last turn the tide. Polio was not the last plague humanity would face, nor the deadliest, but it showed that science could triumph where superstition and despair once ruled. And in the decades that followed, as the world grew more connected, new enemies emerged. Plagues carried not just by rats, lice, or famine, but by the very speed of modern life. These are the stories the world tried to forget, but the night remembers, and so do we. This has been the Nocturnal Archives.